Today, the labor market is the main way that we share out prosperity in society. Most people's jobs are their main, if not their only, source of income. And the vast inequalities that we see already in the labor market, where some people receive far more for their efforts than others, show that this approach is already creaking. And technological unemployment, in my view, is just a more extreme version of that same story, but one that ends where some people receive nothing at all.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, Director of Cambridge Forum, and today we are discussing a rather scary, some might say dystopian topic of living without working. One of the unforeseen effects of COVID has been an accelerated rush towards automation, accompanied by the massive layoffs of millions of workers. This week, the economist forecast that 42% of American jobs that disappeared due to the pandemic will not be coming back. That frightening figure has enormous economic, political, and sociological implications for us all. To help us put this awkward issue into some context, we have with us two bright intellects today, one on either side of the Atlantic. First, I will be introducing Daniel Susskind, who teaches economics at Balliol College, Oxford. His new book is A World Without Work: Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond. It was described by the New York Times as, quote, required reading for any potential presidential candidate thinking about the economy of the future. So I think we can rest assured that the present occupant of the White House might not have requested a copy. However, Daniel's TED Talk has already attracted 1.5 million views about the future of work. So welcome, Daniel, and why did you write this book now?
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be with you. I wrote the book because every day we hear stories of systems and machines that are taking on tasks we thought until very recently only human beings alone could ever do. Driving a car, making a medical diagnosis, drafting a legal contract, writing a news report. What does all of this mean for the vast majority of us for whom our job is our main source of income? I wrote the book, A World Without Work, because I really think this is one of the greatest questions of our time. And I don't think we're taking seriously enough the threat of a future where there's not enough work for people to do because of the remarkable technological advances that are taking place. Now, I'm not saying in the book that there's going to be some dramatic technological big bang in the next few years, after which lots of people suddenly wake up and find themselves without a job. I don't think that's going to happen. Work's going to remain for some time to come, I expect. But what I do think is likely is that as we move through the 21st century, more and more people might find themselves unable to make the sorts of economic contributions to society that they might have hoped or expected to make in the 20th century. And I think this is a fundamental challenge to how we live together today. And the book is trying to make sense of that challenge and set out the problems I think we'll face, and then describe how it is that we ought to respond to them. Shall I say a little about the different ways in which I see this unfolding? Would that be a useful thing absolutely. To do? So in the book, I distinguish between two different types of technological unemployment, two different ways in which we might find ourselves in a situation where some people are unable to work because of the technological changes that are taking place. The first is what I call frictional technological unemployment. And here, there's still work to be done. The problem is that not all workers are able to reach out and take it up. And there are three reasons that I set out for why I think this might happen. The first reason that I think work might sit out of people's reach is what I call the skills mismatch, where displaced workers simply don't have the skills that are required to do the new work created by technological progress. And I think this is probably the most familiar reason for frictional technological unemployment. The second reason for frictional technological unemployment is what I call place mismatch, where displaced workers simply don't live in the same geographical place as the new work that's created. And I think it's worth remembering, just when we think about that, that in the early days of the internet, there really was a moment when it seemed that these sorts of worries about location would just no longer matter. That people spoke about the death of distance and how the world is flat. But actually, in looking for work today, the place where you live matters more than ever. The final reason for frictional technological unemployment is what I call identity mismatch. And this is where displaced workers have an identity rooted in a particular type of work, and they're willing to stay unemployed in order to protect that identity. So, for example, think of adult men in the United States displaced from manufacturing roles by new technologies. There are some who say that they would prefer not to work at all than to take up so-called pink collar work. Now, it's a really unfortunate term, but it's designed to capture the fact that many of the roles currently out of reach of machines are disproportionately held by women. So some teaching, 97.7% of preschool and kindergarten teachers in the US are women, 92.2% of nurses, 82.5% of social workers. Now, I think most of us tend to be comfortable with this idea of frictional technological unemployment. We can readily picture a future in which there's lots of work to be done, but because of those sorts of mismatches I described, not everyone's able to take it up. But as we move through the 21st century, one of the more controversial, but I also think important arguments of the book is that I think we might see the emergence of a second type of technological unemployment, one where there's simply not enough work to be done, full stop. And I call this structural technological unemployment. And this, I think, is a less comfortable idea. And the starting point for thinking about whether something like this is even possible has to be the fact that ever since modern economic growth began 300 or so years ago, people have worried about the economic harm caused by new technologies, and yet those anxieties time and time again have turned out to be misplaced. And so what I do in the book is spend a lot of time trying to explain why, given the remarkable technological changes that are taking place, explain why this time really is different, why it is that now this idea of structural technological unemployment is possible. And all of this, I think, is going to create three fundamental problems for us, three problems for us living together in society. And as I said, the book sets out those problems and says what we ought to do about them. So let me just very briefly say what I think they are. One is an economic problem, and it's, I think, the challenge of inequality. In the book, I say, it's not a coincidence that today worries about economic inequality are intensifying at exactly the same time that anxiety about automation is growing. These two problems, inequality and technological unemployment, I think are very closely related. Today, the labor market is the main way that we share out prosperity in society. Most people's jobs are their main, if not their only, source of income. And the vast inequalities that we see already in the labor market, where some people receive far more for their efforts than others, show that this approach is already creaking. And technological unemployment, in my view, is just a more extreme version of that same story, but one that ends where some people receive nothing at all. The second problem, though, I think has very little to do with economics, and it's this, which is that in the future, our lives are likely to become dominated, I think, by a small number of large technology companies that are responsible for developing many of these technologies in the first place. And in the 20th century, our main worry was with the economic power of corporations. We were concerned about market concentration and profits and pricing. But in the 21st century, I think we'll be far more concerned with their political power, their impact on things like liberty and democracy and social justice. So take a company like Facebook. Yes, in part, people are concerned about their economic power, but they're also concerned about their political power. That, for instance, Russia was able to use the platform to influence the 2016 US presidential election. And I think this concern about power, and in particular political power, is going to become more and more important. The third and final problem, again, doesn't have much to do with economics, and it's the problem of meaning, the challenge of finding meaning in life. It's often said that work isn't simply a means to a wage, but it's also a source of purpose. And if that's right, then technology may not just hollow out the labor market, but it might hollow out the sense of meaning and direction that many people have in life as well. And so these are the three challenges I think we're going to face: inequality, power, and purpose. And the book is about those challenges, and as I said, how I think we ought to respond to them.
Well, there's an awful lot of material there. First of all, it was interesting you did this book after you did a book about the professional classes being hit by this problem. Because initially people thought it was going to be the low-paid essential workers, I hate to use that term, but the low-paid essential workers that didn't have an option to leave New York City when the pandemic broke. The people that were delivering the pizzas and the Amazon drivers, and these people had no control over choosing how to deal with the situation. They just had to stay in their low-paid work. So that was the first class of person that I thought would be hit by it. But in fact, your previous book was saying professional classes are just as much at risk now, because the interesting jobs are also targeted. Both of you, and I'm going to introduce Vikram in any second, are teachers. So I think that that's an enormous question right there. You raised the point that 90-some% of teachers are women. Well, that's all going to change if teaching is going to be based in the home. There's going to be a virtual teacher, or is there going to be a teacher? So before we get on to that point, I want you both to be able to consider that. I think I want to introduce Vikram. I hope everybody can see Vikram. I hope he's on screen. Yeah. Can you see Vikram?
Hi, everyone.
Daniel, can you see everybody?
I can indeed. Yes, I can indeed.
Pleasure to meet you, Daniel.
Pleasure to meet you too.
Okay, so let me tell you that Vikram, you get the name correct. Okay, Mansharamani is a Harvard lecturer, and he's written a new book called Think for Yourself: Restoring Common Sense in an Age of Experts in Artificial Intelligence. And Vikram describes himself as a generalist and a global thinker. And he teaches a lot of different classes at Harvard, including how to navigate uncertainty. So I would think you're in great demand right now. But let's just first of all talk about that question before you talk about why you wrote your book, Vikram. How is this going to impact you directly in the teaching capacity?
Yeah. Let me just make just one observation, which is that you're right that I wrote this book, The Future of the Professions, back in 2015, looking at how technology was affecting the work of lawyers and doctors and teachers and accountants and architects. Because one of the things that I think is quite clear in thinking about the impact of technology is that quite often the level of education that a human being requires to do a particular task is not always a useful signal as to whether or not that task can be automated. Things that we find very easy to do with our hands can be quite hard to automate. Conversely, some of the things we find hardest to do with our heads can be quite simple to automate. And this was the book that we wrote, The Future of the Professions. I co-authored with Richard Susskind, and it's not a coincidence we have the same surname. He is in fact my dad, and he'd spent his career thinking about technology in the legal profession. He wrote his doctorate in the 1980s on artificial intelligence in the law. So almost 40 years ago, he was already trying to build systems that could solve legal problems. And he often found himself talking to audiences of lawyers, and at the end, a stray doctor, teacher, accountant, architect would come to him and say, "This is all very interesting, but what you're saying applies equally well to us too." And that book was a project to think about the professions more generally and how technology was affecting them. In terms of my own role as a teacher, and I write about this in my new book because I think education, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, is one of the most important policy responses that we have in trying to make sure that people are able to do the work that has to be done. I think there are 3 dimensions to this. One is we need to think about what we're teaching. What's the curricula that we are setting out to prepare people for the tasks and activities that they'll have to do in the future? And that, I think, takes up quite a lot of our time. We spend a lot of time thinking about what we teach, and I can share some thoughts of my own on what we ought to teach. But there's other parts that are important as well. One is how we teach. Until this pandemic began, if you had stepped into a traditional classroom, most would have looked exactly the same as they did 100 years ago. You know, the ways in which we teach haven't really changed. And that, of course, is no longer the case. Things have changed fundamentally. And I'm hoping that one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that we may uncover, well, partly we may uncover things that simply don't work. But also we might find ways in which technology can be used to make, in this case, educational knowledge more widely available and more accessible. You know, in a sense, what we're engaged in at the moment is a massive unplanned pilot scheme in the use of technology, particularly in the worlds of white collar work. And we have to try and learn the lessons from this, as I said, unwanted pilot. So we need to think about what we teach. We need to think about how we teach, but we also need to think about when we teach. Again, there's a sort of cultural presumption that education is the sort of thing you do at the start of your life. You spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort on it then, and you get it out of the way. And then you can get on with life and do what you need to do, and you don't need to worry about education with the same sort of seriousness or intensity with which you might have engaged there you were young. And I think that's a big mistake because, you know, there is inevitably a huge amount of uncertainty about what skills and what capabilities might be useful in the future. And the best response to that uncertainty is flexibility, a willingness to retrain and reskill and re-educate throughout life with the same sort of intensity that you might have done at the start of life. So when I think about education, I think, you know, we've got to think about it through multiple different lenses: what we teach, how we teach, and also when we teach.
Okay, Vikram, before you answer the education question, I should put a little bit of a synopsis about what you say in your book. You kind of rally us all to return to our senses, to overcome the love affair we have with technology, to stop being blindsided by minutiae, so we miss the big picture, and to keep, you say, experts on tap, but not on top. Well, this all sounds very attractive. Some might even say a little glib, but I'm skeptical about how we can regain control of our destiny and our decision-making. It sounds to me like we're just staying 1 or 2 steps ahead of the robots. And as Daniel said earlier, much of what's happening to us is being orchestrated and directed by Facebook and Google. Even in the education world, what's going on in our kids' heads. So let me hand over to you, Vikram. I know that was a big question.
Sure. Well, let me begin by commenting on the education. First of all, I have to agree a lot with what Daniel just said about education. You know, it's a topic that I do think hard about. My book, which is called Think for Yourself, could also be, you know, we could retitle it to be Relearn to Think Critically. Because that's ultimately what I'm suggesting here. And when it comes specifically to education, I think there's a fascinating experiment that's happening here as well. Daniel talked about sort of this imposed experiment. The COVID pandemic and the immediate virtualization of education did things that I think were needed to take place. So for instance, you know, Harvard University, where I teach, went 100% virtual by the first full week of March. I think it was the end of the first full week, maybe it was the second week. this is something Harvard would never have tried. They would never have tried to take the entire faculty to teach all classes online. Now, some of these classes are not prone to being taught well online. It's hard to do a lab experiment, etc. But some of the classes, my class included, work quite well online, right? I mean, this is a discussion class. I am able to use breakout rooms. I can actually have groups work together. And I can scale that. I can have larger impact with more feedback, more multiple viewpoints, students from different perspectives being forced to mingle. And I can engineer that as an instructor. I can also poll people without the cross-infection of this person seeing their hands getting raised over here and another person wanting to be like that person, etc. So we can break down the groupthink and actually develop real insights from what people are thinking. And I can get the pulse of the learning side, not just the teaching, but the learning side of the equation. So I might hesitantly say, in some situations, this virtual teaching may in fact be better. So that's worth pausing and thinking about. So that's the tactics of education and technology. Since I came into the conversation late, I want to at least touch on that. The other point that Daniel made, which I want to agree with, tremendous. I think he's spot on here, is what we teach, as well as when we teach. Those 2 points are critical. I am very critical of the idea of skills-based training. Why? Because skills quickly lose their relevance in today's dynamic world. We need to, if you're going to go down the path of training individuals with skills, you need to be ready to retrain them with new skills when they're needed. There needs to be a dynamic logic that allows for the constant retraining. Alternatively, which is what I would suggest is perhaps a different strategy, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but a different one, is we should train people to learn. Right? Teach them how to learn. Give them a breadth of skills, a breadth of capabilities, multiple lenses, if you will, so that they are able to adapt and learn for themselves as the needs change. So, they're related concepts, but I think both of those are thoughts I think come with this idea of rethinking education and how technology can be helpful. Last tidbit that I would just want to insert here on the conversation, since I caught the bit about Facebook and the manipulation of autonomy and our thinking process through algorithms. Of course, that is possible. We saw that with 2016, and there is an elevated risk of it coming into this fall. We know that. In fact, that's part of the reason why I think there's this increasing noise around regulating or managing or fact-checking posts on social media, especially by prominent people with large followings. So I understand that. That is indeed valid. However, I want to suggest there's another side to that same coin, which is, yes, we are getting filtered, very biased information thrown at us, possibly manipulated, but we ourselves, we as the recipients of that information, have stopped thinking about it and stopped realizing that we're getting biased information. We've entered these portals onto social world as presented via social media. And we think of them, or some of us think of them, as reflective of reality. That is equally problematic. That opens us up to the loss of autonomy. Being able to think critically about the information we receive, whether or not it is biased, thinking critically about whether or not there are other perspectives, and in fact going out to seek those other perspectives, I think can help immunize partially our vulnerability to the manipulation of information that comes through social media and other algorithms. So I'll pause there.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a lot, because people would say we're deluged with information and people are completely at sea about what's true and what's not true. And I don't know how you retrain your brain to be a critical thinker if you've become addicted, as most people have, to getting their information from their phone or...
Sure. Well, Mary, I would say one thing, for instance, I think it's fairly easy, I would suggest, to put if you're on Twitter and you want to follow Fox News, you may get a different perspective than if you only follow other sources. That is not a difficult thing to do. It may be an uncomfortable thing to do. Forcing yourself to consume information that you might naturally disagree with. I think those are little tidbits that can help us overcome the overly biased nature of some of our echo chambers that we live in.
Okay, we've got a few questions coming in here. This is such a huge topic, but let's stick for a moment with the education thing, because Howard Gardner has typed a question in. Hello, Daniel. I was struck by your point about meaning and purpose. Throughout most of history, in most of the world, people have gotten a sense of purpose significantly from their religious beliefs. What are your views, either in the book or live today, about the course of religions going forward in an increasingly work-free environment?
Thank you very much for the question, Howard. And it's Howard, very kindly, we spoke together when my dad and I were working on the future of the professions, and kindly offered his time for an interview, and it was very much appreciated. The final part of my book is all about this question of meaning and purpose, because there is, I think, a conventional wisdom that work is one of the only sources of meaning and purpose for many people. And what I try and do in the book is two things. One is just to point out that for many people, work isn't a source of meaning and purpose. For many people, they don't think their work makes a particularly important contribution to the world. They don't get a strong sense of identity and purpose from it. The second is to show that there's been very different relationships between work and meaning over time. That, if you go back to ancient times, the ancient Egyptian city of Thebes, for instance, you were banned from seeking political office if you'd engaged in trade in the last 10 years. In the ancient city of Sparta, you were banned from law if you were a citizen from engaging in productive work. Both Aristotle and Plato thought work was a sort of prohibitively grubby affair. You could only get meaning through leisure. So part of what I'm trying to do is this relationship between work and meaning doesn't necessarily hold for everyone. Part of what I'm trying to do is show that relationship's changed over time. But I think it is clear that for some people, it is an important source of meaning and purpose. And so the question is, what happens, or where do people get their sense of meaning and purpose from in a world where there may be less work? And Howard's response, I think, is one, which is that perhaps there's a sort of retreat to religion, and you might point to the relative robustness of religions in the Western world today as a sort of sign that perhaps people are already retreating in some sense to faith or religion as a source of meaning in light of the sort of insecurities and difficulties of contemporary economic life. I think that's quite an interesting thought. But what I argue in the book is that I think there's an important conversation that we need to have about if we think we might be moving to a world with less work, and it becomes less and less a debate about the future of work and more about a debate about the future of leisure and how people spend their spare time and what it means to spend your spare time in a meaningful way, or a way that others feel is that you feel is valuable and important, but also others feel that might be valuable and important and meaningful. And the reason I say that is because one of my worries about a world with less work is that if we find ourselves in a society where some people work and others don't, it undermines the sort of sense of social solidarity that exists today, from a feeling that we're all pulling our economic weight, that everyone is paying into the collective pot through the work that they do and the taxes that they pay, or if they're not in work and able to work, that they're actively looking for work. And so what I write about a lot in the book is, well, maybe if we find ourselves in a world with less work, maybe those who aren't working might be asked to make some kind of non-economic contribution instead to society, some other meaningful, socially valuable useful activity in return for the support that they get from the community that they're part of. And I have a conversation about what I think those meaningful activities might be. And they're not religious in nature. But I think that's the sort of conversation that's quite interesting and important to have if we think we're moving to a world with less work.
So this brings up a lot of questions. People are putting a lot of comments here. What's the difference in your mind between a job and work? Let's make sure we remember that work is both paid and unpaid. People can find meaning in unpaid work, but there needs to be income support. So I guess my biggest fear is these sci-fi films I've seen where, you know, all the kind of the proletariat are on one planet and they're doing all the drudgery and taking care of all the recycled junk. And then on this other gated community in space, you've got all the kind of technocrats that are orchestrating what goes on the lower level. And that I guess that's my biggest fear, is that you have the haves, the 2% haves, and then you have this huge slew of people that are just getting by. Do you think that that is what's going to be the end game here? Or, because somebody's got to do all those deliveries of the Amazon products. Somebody's got to be the driver, right? And there's got to be more and more warehouses. I read an article about London turning into this, where people, instead of buying real estate to do it over now, they're doing it into large warehousing facilities because people are going to be ordering all their stuff virtually, more and more of it.
Vikram, do you want to respond to that? Or...
Yeah, well, Daniel, it's funny because I thought it might make, this is actually an interesting point through which perhaps we could turn this into a dialogue, because you know, yeah. I didn't hear the very beginning of your comments, but one of the things that I would ask is, as we progress towards a world with less work, does that call into question the very economic organization of society away from more of the capitalist logic and towards a communist logic, for instance, right? I mean, in fact, inequality might be reflective of the destruction process of capitalism, right? I mean, I've sort of done some thinking about this and concluded that inequality left unchecked will of course result in these dynamics. And in fact, you know, Marx and Engels may have been right. And if you get to the point where from each according to their abilities and to each according to their needs is the outcome, you know, what does that mean? So I'm sort of curious what you think about that. You can sort of tie a couple of these issues together. And
so I write in the book about what do we need to do. You know, if the fundamental economic challenge that we face in a world with less work is one of inequality, it's a distributional challenge. How do we share our income in society when our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, might be less effective? What might take its place? Well, the argument I make in the book is that the only other feasible mechanism really is the state, that we need the state to take a larger role in distributing or sharing resources in society. And I call it the big state. And it sounds, it might sound relatively dystopic, but it's not the big state of the 20th century. It's not teams of planners sitting in rooms with blueprints trying to plan and control entire economies from the top down. That's not what I have in mind. It's not a state that gets involved in production, but it's a state that gets far more involved in distribution. If our traditional ways of sharing prosperity are less effective than they might have been in the past. I mean, I should also just say that I think it's really important that, you know, my book is fundamentally a very optimistic one. It's an optimistic book. And the reason is simple, which is that in the 21st century, I think technological progress is likely to solve, you know, the fundamental economic challenge that has plagued our ancestors for centuries. So if you think of the economy as a pie, as economists like to do, you know, the fundamental challenge that we have faced up until now is how to make that pie large enough for everyone to live on. You know, go back to the turn of the 1st century AD, and if you had taken the global economic pie and divided it up into equal slices for everyone in the world, most people would get a few hundred of today's dollars. You know, almost everyone lived on or around the poverty line. And if you had rolled forward 1,000 years, roughly the same would have been true. But over the last 300 years, economic growth has just taken off, and those pies have exploded in size. Global GDP per head, the value of those individual slices of the pie, are worth almost $11,000 today. 35 years, it'll be 22,000. Another 35 years, and it will be 44,000. You know, we've come very close to solving that fundamental economic problem that plagued our ancestors for centuries. And in a strange way, I see technological unemployment as a symptom of that success.
Sure.
That in the 21st century, we're going to solve one problem. How do we make the pie large enough for everyone to live on? But we're going to replace it, at least when we're thinking in terms of economics, with another one, which is, well, how on earth do we slice up that pie when our traditional way of doing so,
Sure.
paying people for the work that they do? And I can't see any other mechanism that we could use other than the state.
Well, you know, I would also ask the question of, does this world where the state is so focused on distribution impact the very nature of production? So the incentives that inequality, for all its warts, provide is that I can be really innovative. I can get huge gains on my innovation. That incentive structure, in fact, is responsible for many of these gains you highlight, right? And so is it not that dynamic capitalist instinct, which a necessary side of is inequality, right? We should, in fact, we can even ask ourselves, what are we seeking? Inequality of outcomes or inequality of opportunities? There's nuances that we should distinguish there, but might there be an ideal where equality of opportunity necessarily enables inequality of outcomes, but we just need to sort of provide a nice safety net that everyone benefits at least somewhat, but allow for the inequality, because that's the incentive for continued progress, continued innovation, and et cetera. It's not the distribution problem, it's the production problem.
I mean, I don't think we ought to be. The argument I'm making is not one that we need to live in an equal society, and we can have an interesting conversation about inequality and why it might be a good thing, or indeed why it might be a bad thing. The point I'm making is more fundamental than that, which is just if there are some people in society who can no longer get an income through the work that they do, then we need to find a different mechanism to provide those people with an income. And if the sorts of arguments that I'm making in the book are right, then as we move through the 21st century, that's going to happen for more and more people. And you know, our existing welfare system, which is essentially designed to be like a kind of trampoline, where if you fall out of the labor market, you are sort of thrown back into it with the right skills and capabilities, might no longer work in a world where, you know, there might simply not be enough work for people to bounce into. And this is the argument I'm making in the latter part of the book, that how do we keep a society together where some people aren't able to make an economic contribution? And I think we need to have a conversation about what sort of non-economic contributions they should make. But I should say that I think all of this, you know, this isn't the challenge we face now. I don't think structural technological unemployment is the challenge of the moment. More what we face is frictional. There's plenty of work to be done. The challenge is just how do we prepare people to do that work? I mean, I should say, what we haven't spoken about, and I'd be interested to talk about, is the relationship between these ideas and what's happening at the moment. Because, you know, what I found so striking in thinking about this pandemic and the challenges that we face is that these challenges I thought we'd face of inequality and power and meaning at some point in the 21st century because of automation, we now face right now because of this virus. So, you know, think of inequality. You know, robots haven't taken all the jobs, but this virus has completely decimated the demand that so many of these jobs rely upon. And so we face this challenge. How do we share out prosperity when we can't rely upon the world of work to do it, when there aren't jobs for people to do? And what have we seen? We've seen the state step forward to take around the world to take a a role that was previously unimaginable. Or think about power. It's a very conspicuous feature of what's happening at the moment that a small number of large technology companies appear to be doing very well, and yet the vast majority of small businesses, which make up the backbone of economic life, are really struggling. Or think about meaning. Think about how much has been written in the last few weeks about how to spend our time well in this sort of enforced idleness. I think a lot of us have a very good sense of what gainful employment looks like. I don't think we have a good sense of what gainful unemployment looks like. I think there's a lot of restlessness and anxiety at the moment about how we ought to spend our time during lockdown. And so I just think it's interesting that whether or not we face a world with less work because of this virus or because of automation, the challenges are very much the same. And if there's a silver lining in this crisis, then perhaps it will be that some of the ideas that I set out in the book, which were at one point sort of dismissed as outlandish, but yet we now see as being almost completely commonplace around the world at the moment, that perhaps we'll be better prepared when we face other challenges in decades to come because of technology.
Wow. We've got about 10 comments and questions flying in here, long, big, because there's so much territory being covered. So one person, Bilal Mujai, says, if tomorrow Zoom offers money for webinars, then you will see the information quality go down the gutter. Howard responded to you by saying, thanks for unpacking the different facets of meaning and purpose and how that might need to be reconfigured with or without religious envelope in a workless world, because we know that even those who do not particularly like their job do get a sense of identity from it. That's a really good point. Jonathan Hoffman says, as wealth and resources are concentrated in a decreasing oligarchy, how are the rest of society to live in safety and dignity when all are free to focus on concerns that are not all about the basic survival needs? Sharon Keith, you talked about where you get information. I absolutely agree with Vikram that one must keep informed with both sources and stories with which we fundamentally disagree or even believe to be factual. However, I find that this process takes a huge emotional toll. Any reliable methods we can hone to preserve our sanity while we hone our critical thinking skills. That's a very good point. Okay, well, that's enough for now. And then I got a whole bunch more. So any suggestions there on the critical thinking front?
Yeah, go on, Vikram. I'd be interested to hear what you have. Yeah.
Well, look, I think her point is well taken, which is it can be emotionally challenging and draining to proactively seek views with which you disagree. Really what I'm trying to do here is not get any side to convert, if you will, but rather to appreciate and understand the perspectives that those that have different conclusions are coming from. So, the only strategy I have is to take it in doses. You don't need to sit there and turn on, if you are a believer of a particular view, you don't need to drink from the fire hose of the other perspective, but rather take a drop here and there to really develop some sense of the perspective. You don't have to get into the arguments, but you do need to appreciate the perspectives. And so doses of them, I think, is sort of one strategy to do so. So yeah, Daniel, anything to add to that?
I just noticed the question from Tim that has just come in, which I thought was really interesting. Our challenge is not how do we prepare people to do the work, it's how do we in society at large learn how to reward people adequately for the necessary work that they're doing. And it was something that I wrote about a lot in the book in the context of automation, that so many jobs that exist today, there's such a great mismatch between the social value of the work that's done and the value that the work appears to receive in the market, between sort of wages and the social value of work. And it's something that has really, I think, been very clear in this crisis as well. In Britain, with if you look down the various occupations that have been called key workers, many of them we all recognize as being socially incredibly valuable jobs, and yet the They're almost all low-paid jobs. And and one of the things I called for in the book, in thinking about automation, I think applies equally well now, which is that there's a real opportunity to try and address this mismatch between the social value of work and the wage that a lot of these jobs receive. I mean, it might sound relatively radical, but my starting point in the book was that, you know, the employer, at least in the UK, for many of these key workers, is already the state. It doesn't take too much for the state to change those wages and to signal to the rest of the market that these are roles that are worth recognizing and valuing. But again, I think this mismatch between the value of work and the wages it receives is something that is going to be on our minds more and more in the coming years.
Yeah. So can I ask a question, Mary? So Daniel, I'm curious whether you think it's the actual progress of technology or more the pace of progress of technology that matters. And I'll describe it this way. You know, here in the United States, the most numerous profession, meaning the most number of people engaged, is truck driving. There's 2-point-something million truck drivers in America, all earning a reasonable wage. Transporting essential goods around became more important in this crisis, etc.
Yeah.
And I would suggest to you that over a normal technological adoption cycle, as historically may have taken time, you know, the fax machine, et cetera, it takes time for technologies to really permeate and diffuse, that we would have adapted, that slowly we'd have fewer entrants into a profession, the retirees would go and the profession would shrink. It's my proposition to you that actually pace matters more than the disruption, that we humans can adapt. And so the concern I would have is the pace of disruption. So if we were to get autonomous truck driving, for instance, I think it's a ways away, but if we were to, would it not be the case that suddenly all trucks would get automated almost instantaneously? I say instantaneously, but you know, over a period of 3 to 5 years, rather than a 40-year cycle, such that we wouldn't have the retirees dropping off and the new entrants not coming and the profession shrinking, but we would see a massive disruption instantaneously or relatively instantaneously. So is it not a pace matter rather than a disruption matter?
I think pace is so important, but I think I think in practice it's both. It's both pace, clearly, but also it's the range as well. The process I write about in the book, I call it task encroachment. Just relentless advance of systems and machines into areas of activity we thought only human beings alone could do, and that's partly what has caught people flat-footed. That certain tasks and activities we thought were out of reach aren't out of reach. And I think similarly, what's caught people flat-footed is the pace, exactly as you say. And I think it's a combination of both of these things.
Sure.
So there's been quite a lot of people writing articles about this new world. The Economist had this piece today. Working life has entered a new era. BC was before Corona, AD's after domestication. And it says the shift may rival great workplace transformations of the 19th and 20th centuries. Twitter has said now its employees can all work from home permanently. Facebook are following suit. And some of the changes have attracted lots of positive affirmations from the classes that, you know, have perhaps nice and satisfying jobs, pretty decently paid. The poorly paid essential workers have been left behind by and large. They're the ones that are left in New York City after everybody left. The things that were listed in this article about things that will be missed: casual collisions. These are when you spark creative ideas through spontaneous meetings, camaraderie, all of which are pretty much impossible on Zoom, I think. The end of a 5-day working week, where weekends now morph into your work days, which was already beginning, and now there's just no division. No barrier between home and work life. Space for de-stressing is gone between work and home. Fewer excuses for men to skip cleaning and childcare, it said. Uh, homeschooling and higher education, what will happen? Well, we've covered that pretty much. And then how do we halt the relentless robotic advance, which threatens to replace work that we actually enjoy and value, that gives us a lot of self-worth? So some of these things were raised in the Economist piece today. Any comments there about the actual sociological impact on our day-to-day lives?
I mean, I think it's fascinating, and I think it raises a lot of issues, Mary, that you've already hit on here in describing it. I would highlight, let's start with that first point about the sort of fortuitous interactions. I forget what the exact phrasing was.
They call them casual collisions.
Fine. The casual collisions. You know, when I said earlier that certain classes might lend themselves a little bit better to online interactions, like my class, a discussion-oriented class, that is for sure one thing that gets lost, is these casual collisions, if you will, the fortuitous interactions that can spur better relationships and learning in different ways. And so, you know, I think what Zoom, et cetera, has done is it's effectively unbundled the social and the intellectual, which had previously been bundled. And I would argue there was cross-fertilization in a very positive way by having in-person interactions in an educational environment. You can combine that further with a residential learning environment, which, you know, the conversation went from the classroom into the dining hall, onto the playing fields and into the gym and into the libraries. And that sort of supportive ecosystem is gone. So there's definitely a loss in that way, for sure. So anyway, that was the one point I wanted to highlight on the casual collisions.
It's a really
work week. You know, this work is going to be like the backdrop to our life now. I mean, we always had that problem of the emails coming in and the text messages. Now, there's nothing to stop it, really.
Yeah,
I go on, Vikram. Sorry.
No, I have a very quick point, Daniel. So I would just say it requires a lot more self-management. We need to be aware of it. It requires more mindfulness, Mary, in the sense that, you know, we can actually turn off our email. You can actually turn off the phone. I mean, they have on-off buttons. You can disconnect them from the internet. You can use the airplane mode. We're not getting on an airplane. Let's not let the mode go to waste.
I agree, but are you teaching that to your students? Because it's not our generation that has the issue with this. It's the ones, you know, I've seen it in teenagers and my grown-up kids, that they learn to sleep with their phone. I mean,
well, I'll give you this one tidbit, which is an interesting story. So a couple of years ago, one of my students came to me after graduating, had gone to go work for Goldman Sachs and was working around the clock, as these analysts do. And he was leaving the job. He was, I know his boss said he was a superstar, and he calls and he says, Vikram, I'm leaving my job. I'm going to move on to do this. I said, wow, that's stunning. I heard you were doing really well. What was it? Was it work-life balance that was thrown out of kilter? Is that your primary motivation? And he stopped and he sort of laughed and he said, Vikram, you don't understand us millennials, do you? And I said, obviously not. Obviously not. But please tell me. He said, I'm not looking for work-life balance. I'm looking for work-life integration. I want to do what I enjoy. I want it to blend with my values. I want it to be one and the same. I don't want to feel like I'm separate in my sense of purpose in personal life and purpose in work. I'd like them to blend.
Let me just, before we go any further, there's more people talking about the teaching thing. It's really hit a nerve here. Somebody also said it takes a humongous amount of time to seek out alternative information sources. I just barely read some of Ross Duhant and David, what's his name? I don't know what that means. Okay. And somebody else has, Tim again has said, there is pretty clear pattern emphasized by the type and pace of change we're facing. Summarized with great clarity by Naomi Klein in Screen New Deal, High-Tech Coronavirus Dystopia. Naomi Klein, The Intercept. She made this clear concerning healthcare and education. So there's 2 links there I can post on our website if people want to read those. Jonathan Hoffman, Finding Purpose in One's Work, ? What a concept. Mm-hmm. So I still think we're back to this thing of, I just want to come back to the point you said about regaining control, Vikram, in your book. I love the idea of it. I'm not sold on it. How can you regain control when the robots at Amazon warehouse dictate the rate at which the workers have to fill the orders? The robots set the pace. Sure.
So my point on thinking for yourself and reclaiming control is really about what we choose to think about, how we choose to think. It's not really about profession and work. It's more about the ideas that we don't have to be manipulated into what we think through algorithms that choose what they present us to pay attention to, that we can mindfully manage where we focus our attention and mindfully pay attention to what we think is worthy of incorporating into our view. The book is really about managing expertise and technologies and how they affect our thinking, right? So, you know, historically we have had this ping pong ball-esque sort of existence and relationship with experts where we have either completely deferred to them or completely dismissed them. And my point is really that we should do neither, that there is a role for experts and that to reclaim control of that relationship is critical. And by reclaiming control, we can tap into what is best offered from experts, technologies, etc., while also retaining, you know, the sort of control position of being on top. And so, as you said earlier, you know, keep experts on tap, not on top, is sort of the way I bring that home to roost. The other implication of that is that we can find a greater emphasis on the context in which decisions are being made, because we should pay attention to the context, because experts live within silos and technologies have silos. And so they don't have broad relevance to all aspects of our lives. And so we need to keep their insights segmented and understand they are constrained, that they don't understand or appreciate the decision context. So that's really what I'm talking about when I talk about reclaiming autonomy and control. It's more of a, where do we choose to think? How do we choose to think? And what do we choose to think about?
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. Someone said they want to hear, I don't know what they want to hear from Daniel. They just said they want to hear from Daniel. So I think my last question is to do with this work-life balance. If tomorrow the government said, well, we're going to give you 15 hours pay a week, both of you guys would be fine, I think, with that, because you've got the ability to independently source your ideas and the expertise to market them, correct? You wouldn't have to rely on your 15 hours of teaching if that's what they were going to pay you. But what would you suggest would be a livable wage? I mean, how do you come up with that?
I mean, it's something I'll just, something I write about in the book, because one of the ideas that's often put forward as a solution to the challenge of automation is universal basic income. And I'm quite skeptical of the idea in the book because, I mean, very crudely, I think it's an imperfect solution to a problem we don't yet face. A problem we don't yet face because, as I said, at the moment, our challenge, at least with respect to technology, is not that there's not enough jobs to be done. It's more, well, how do we get people in a position that they're able to take up those jobs? But the reason I say that, though, is because one of the things I do in the book is ask, okay, well, universal basic income, what does that actually mean? You know, what do we mean by income? Are we talking about paying it as a cash payment directly into people's accounts? Or do we maybe mean in the form of a service that everybody gets access to good education, good healthcare system? So it's a sort of income in kind. Similarly, for the universal, what do we mean by that? Who's in and who's out? It's fudging the most difficult question, which is who's part of our community, who counts as a member, who's eligible for this payment. But the thing that matters in respect to your question is, well, what do we mean by basic? How much is a basic income? And I've got no easy answers here. There's been a lot of disagreement over the centuries about what it means to think about a basic income. Some people have said, you know, just enough to get by and no more. Others have said something far grander, that you know, it's what you need in order to find yourself in a situation that you can flourish in life. I don't think they're I don't think you can give a sort of precise answer to that question without taking various positions on this idea of what basic actually means.
It's a difficult one. Maybe Jeff Bezos might have an answer for us about what the basic income. But he seems to be doing pretty well right now with the present situation, I think. Yeah. With I wish some of it would float down towards because I think he's hiring tons of new people, apparently, right? They've got lots more warehouses, and maybe this is the future. Well, I would love to go on because we've had lots more questions coming in. Someone said, work-life balance is a source of anxiety that's exacerbated by our constant interface with instant information. How about work-life rhythm? A natural rise and fall of priorities, focusing on one person or task or leisure, and then set that focus aside and take up another. I like your ideas, Shannon. All right, well, I'd like to go on, but it's 3 o'clock and I know you guys are lined up for more Zoom encounters, and it's late in the UK. Daniel, thanks for...
Yeah, lined up for fatherhood now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
daughter.
So I want to thank both of you, Vikram Mansharamani from Harvard, whose book is Think for Yourself, Restoring Common Sense in an Age of Experts and AI, and Daniel Susskind, who's written A World Without Work, Technology, Automation, and How We Should Respond. Both of those are on our website, if you can't remember those titles. And we are grateful to Herbert and Dorothy Vetter for enabling us to make Cambridge Forum, also the Lowell Institute, Massachusetts Cultural Council, and First Parish Church in Cambridge. Thanks to everybody who came and participated today. I'm sorry I couldn't take all your questions. More details of future programs are on our website, www.cambridgeforum.org. Thank you all for joining us. See you all soon. Bye-bye.